Thanks again for the invitation. So the topic today is animals. Yeah, so I'll also take this as an opportunity to sort of, try to sort of chart some uncommon ground, perhaps also to push the envelope a little bit further than I've done already. And therefore, I think it's sort of, one note that not everything what I say is set in stone, but it's really meant as a sort of an offer for discussion, and we can take up all of the points that you gather during my presentation in the subsequent discussion. So I've entitled my talk "Deep Human-Animal Prehistories for the Anthropocene," and I will try, in line with the framing of this seminar series, to sort of convince you that the deep past has a lot to offer for thinking about the present and also the future. And I will in particular make the argument that the other animals with whom humans have shared the planet for thousands and sometimes even millions of years have actually played key roles in the biocultural evolution of our own species. I will mainly talk about the time frame before the present Holocene warm period, that is the Pleistocene, and tackle how animals have variously cast their shadow on the becoming and cultural evolution of our species, as I said. So my main argument is that thinking through and with animals about humans and the planet helps us actually better understand what the Anthropocene is all about, and also where we can go from there, perhaps. Oops, sorry, that was not what I wanted. Okay, sorry. So deep prehistory in that view sort of provides a testing ground and a quasi laboratory, if you like, for assessing some of the foundational questions around animals, the foundational role and changing status in the human story. And the organizers have asked us to ponder upon and, if possible, define new agendas, Anthropocene agendas for environmental archaeology. And I think one way to do so is to belabor the uneasy tension between the human and the non-human. So that's why I talk about animals today, which is really built in our fundamental understanding of what the Anthropocene is. On the one hand, we can say that if the Anthropocene heralds a new epoch defined by the rise of the human as a prime geological force and fundamental Earth system agent, life on the planet fundamentally depends to an unprecedented extent on human behavior and choice. Yet, if the Anthropocene also precipitates the epochal collapse of human history and natural history, as Dipesh Chakrabarty, for instance, has put it, it becomes increasingly problematic, in fact, to separate the human from the supposedly external nature and to locate human agency somewhere, perhaps even in time, but that is another issue. So this really leads us to the paradox of the Anthropocene, which is conceived at least as a consequential rupture in Earth history, transforming the status of human agency to emerge as a central planetary node, while at the same time promoting new forms of nature culture synthesis, what some people have called nature cultures, where the contours of the human and the non-human are fundamentally subverted. So in other words, the Anthropocene recenters human agency in geological time, but simultaneously makes clear that we are not only a part of nature, but nature is also a part of us, that each action provokes environmental reaction, or perhaps more provocatively, counteraction, and that dependency is always mutual, in that sense, somewhat sort of undermining thesis one. So my talk is motivated by three theses that derive from these 3 points that I just outlined. And that really derive from this whole problem context of the paradox of the Anthropocene. So thesis one is that understanding the significance of the Anthropocene and its conditions of becoming really requires to examine the configuration of past Earth systems and the defining agencies from a qualitative perspective. And here I essentially agree with Clive Hamilton that at the core of the Anthropocene is a rupture really in the history of Earth systems, and that we therefore need to analyze is its emergence, the emergence of the Anthropocene as a consequence of, and perhaps also in opposition to, past Earth system configurations, not just environmental impact and domination, for example. My argument here is essentially that animals are foundational Earth system agents of the deep past, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second thesis is that the paradox of the Anthropocene is probably a conceptual artifact that mainly derives from our undifferentiated human nature stipulations. And explicating the Anthropocene and disclosing its unique historicity, therefore also necessitates to account for the over-exhaustive heterogeneity of reality, I call it. And I mean, this is basically what it comes down to deconstruct our concepts of nature and the natural environment, which is mainly basically, I mean, approached as a more or less monolithic phenomenon, or too often at least. So I believe that new environmental archaeologies need to tear apart our received notion of the environment. And the Anthropocene not only forced us to rethink the relations between the natural and the social, but also to more forcefully ask the question, who is actually responsible for certain environmental conditions, and who maintains, disturbs, and transforms them in certain points in time. The third thesis, finally, is that it is, from my perspective, highly misleading to search for the origins of the Anthropocene in deep time. But what we can do, I think, is perhaps better understand it as an unintended consequence of evolving human nature dynamics, reaching out a point of no return, or a tipping point. So this calls for, I mean, this sort of reiterates this metaphor of the regime shift that I touched upon earlier. So thesis 3 is connected to thesis 1, the idea of the Anthropocene as rupture. And what the deep time perspective of archaeology offers here, I think, is a unique capacity to dismember and rearticulate path dependencies and long-term directionalities that emerge out of a myriad of heterogeneous inputs and regularly escape the intentions, motivations, and ambitions of those involved. And I think that animals, I mean, really play a key role in this. And although some people have begun to sort of try to tackle this, I think it's widely underappreciated. So what is the environment then? And how must we as sort of aspiring new environmental archaeologists reimagine its fundamental subject matter? So I believe it is important to realize here that the environment as such has little empirical reality. There is no bound entity out there that we can describe, study, and qualify as one could say, and simply name it the environment. In fact, it might be argued, I would say, that the term environment was never really coined to designate something out there, but its purpose was rather to enable ordering the world, following, I mean, especially preconceived categorical fracture lines, such as nature with culture, for instance, human with non-human, body with mind, or intentionality and morality with instinct. And so forth. So the notion of the environment actually perpetuates a old Cartesian legacy and inherits an inside-outside logic that is no longer tenable, especially under Anthropocene conditions, I would say. But what is the environment then? Do we need to abandon the term altogether? I think we should rather explicate the environmental and pay more attention to its living and non-living components and most effective parts. And what these most effective parts are might actually change in time. So if we come to realize that the idea of the environment is not more than a mere spatio-temporal container populated and made possible by a multitude of variegated entities, legacies, and agencies, and therefore always remains a mere abstraction from real-world phenomena, can reach out to these various entities and examine how they co-make and intersect with each other, including human beings. So the bird's eye perspective on environments and landscapes, like the one encapsulated by the image shown on this slide, is therefore misleading at best. Where are the organisms who inhabit the environment, hold it together, and render it vibrant? Most environments harbor animals, and the environments of the past, present, and future that concern us as humans can either be defined with positive or negative animal reference. Pleistocene environments, for instance, were uniquely rich and diverse in animal communities. Some would say they were even overcrowded with animal others, while the Anthropocene threatens to launch a new mass extinction, which is projected to substantially reduce animal species diversities across the globe. So given all of this, it is perhaps surprising that much traditional environmental archaeology, in my view, is notably animal blind. Animals are only rarely studied for their own sake, or for what their environmental agency and efficacy in specific settings was, and they're instead routinely approached as license plates, one could say, for particular past climatic, vegetational, or physical landscape conditions. This has only recently changed, I think, with the emergence of social zooarchaeology, as for instance pioneered by Larissa Russell and others, or labels like ethnozooarchaeology in the wake of Angelo Trentecost and Umberto Albarella, for instance. But even these developments, I think, remain primarily concerned with studying the social roles and significance of animals for and in past human societies. So it is how humans have treated and viewed animals that matters most. The history of environmental archaeology, one can say, largely recapitulates Western nature culture polarities for that reason. Environmental archaeology's traditional earth and life scientific fellowship, I think, has created the curious situation that animals are either addressed exclusively in biological terms, for instance, as biostratigraphical markers or as past pro-toto of the environment as a whole, and on the other hand, and this is sort of the only viable sort of alternative, or has been so far, is that the historical separation of zooarchaeology and paleontology and environmental archaeology's close affiliation with traditional archaeology's human-oriented goals and concerns has basically led to the study of past animals, as sort of the study of how animals were culturally treated and framed. And this kind of ironically brackets the animal in and of itself out of the study design, one could say. And it's only a very recent development that the contour lines of the two varieties of zooarchaeology, so the one sort of biological and the other social cultural, have become increasingly blurred. Naomi Sykes' Beastly Questions, for example, animal answers to archaeological issues from 2014 is a good example of this emerging and more integrative take on past animals, which is in part, at least, certainly inspired by a growing body of evidence that animal others also and unquestionably have what we call cultures and societies. So the biological perspective on animals is also becoming more and more empirically untenable. So this graph shows three alternative modes of theorizing and understanding animals in the past, and each, I think, is bound up to its own canon of theories and research concepts. So so can you see this arrow? Yeah. So this representation stands for the anthropocentric, or tries to capture the anthropocentric model, which is often coupled with a resource theoretical rendering of animal others. So animals are recast here as resources for human subsistence, technology, and culture. They are, for instance, seen as vehicles of cosmology and symbolism, and sometimes simply as mirrors of human identity, so that we see in animals what we actually are. And above all, in this view, animals come into view as either good to eat with or good to think with. B, the alternative, a strong contender of A, is the ecocentric model of animals, in which animal behavior is either fully determined by its associated environment, or it is simply treated as an inert, passive backdrop of human history and evolution. C, the third model, is the relational model, in which the interstices between humans and animal others are brought to the center of attention. And sort of in which, at the very extreme at least, the boundaries between the two are blurred to the extent that both the human and the animal as analytical categories are lost and are merged into each other. So this is what this element shows. So the challenge of the relational model, model C, which is here marked in purple, is to give equal credit to the claims of both players, to situate them in their respective ecologies, and to study what I call their coming together, as well as the material, immaterial effects of particular human-animal constellations, without, and that's the key, unmaking the specificity of both players, both the human and the animal. And multi-species archaeology, here the eponymous 2018 volume edited by Suzanne Pille-Burch on the right, is one attempt to do so. I think in general, new Anthropocene agendas for environmental archaeology require us to overcome both anthropocentric and ecocentric approaches that I've just outlined, and to marry the many achievements of a relational, context-dependent understanding of human-animal relationships with the insights and theoretical resources of the environmental humanities, especially the rapidly expanding field of animal studies, an example here on the left, and the emerging still transdisciplinary field of environmental studies. Here one key publication on the right. So the remainder of my presentation is in some sense an exploration, albeit of course an idiosyncratic and somewhat selective one, of this very potential, so better integrating these two sources of knowledge and argumentation for writing new animal-oriented deep prehistories. So I will first try to throw the Anthropocene very quickly in its deep time relief to set the scene for a more, perhaps I hope, more nuanced exploration of changing human-animal constellations in the Pleistocene. This exploration focuses more or less systematically, I hope, on particular key species and their enrollment in the unfolding human story. You can see the species that I hope to cover here. I will then end at the very end with a brief plea for the need to write more inclusive deep histories of life itself and to reorientate environmental archaeology accordingly, epistemologically, theoretically, and empirically. So the deep time perspective that archaeology, especially Pleistocene archaeology, can offer provides access to over 3 million years of combined human and natural history, with many lessons, I would say, some more subtle and some extremely powerful, to inform both the present and the future of our species and the planetary system as a whole. This deep time panorama allows us to develop a better grasp on the long-term trends that enabled the planetary regime shifts, which ultimately gave rise to Anthropocene conditions. So the figure on the top is based on data collected by Tyler Faith and colleagues, and outlines some of the major trends in richness and diversity of mega herbivores and mega carnivores through this time frame. The blue Simpson diversity curve that you see here is inverse, so that values close to 1 signal relatively low levels of community diversity and numbers close to 0 relatively high levels. So the data show that throughout human evolution, the diversity of megafaunal communities steadily decreased, and both mega herbivores and mega carnivores did gradually disappear from the ancestral landscapes that ancient hominins inhabited. So in parallel to these developments, this is what sort of the bottom figure tries to encapsulate. Hominins exhibited an unstable growth and decline pattern in terms of their species diversity. This is the brown curve. But at the same time experienced the gradual expansion of brain volumes and especially effective population sizes. This is the gray curve here at the bottom, which then just explodes in this direction. So note that the Anthropocene radicalizes many of these deep time developments. We witness, for instance, a dramatic drop-off of large-bodied animals, reduced community diversity in the animal realm, and exploding population sizes within Homo sapiens populations, while Homo sapien also remains the only surviving hominin form at the end of from the beginning of the Pleistocene Holocene boundary. So Note also the sharp drop-off here in hominin species diversity at the very end of the Pleistocene, which is, I mean, it's interesting that we have a peak here, but then it suddenly drops, and this is related to Homo sapiens being the only surviving species. So this is also, I mean, in some sense, a crucial precondition for the emergence of the Anthropocene. So, and now I come to actually to my key point, as Hervé Bocheron has perceptively noted already, this might in fact, so this whole pattern might in fact suggest that some of the key ecosystem services performed by Pleistocene megafauna were gradually adopted and in the process transformed by emerging horticultural and agricultural human societies, which took shape at the dawn of the Holocene warm period. So independently of whether or not we find the details of this argument convincing, the point is that Earth system dynamics in the depth of the Pleistocene were certainly very different from what happened afterwards and what then characterizes the emerging Anthropocene now. And that a lot of this has actually to do with the role of the rich, large-bodied mammal communities that inhabited the Pleistocene world. So these animals, I would say, did not just signify the environments they lived in. They contributed fundamentally to their fabrication, maintenance, and reproduction. For example, through the specific and invasive and difference-making grazing behavior, the mobility, and the various ways of manipulating growing cycles and pollination patterns, and this on a really large scale. So many of the now extinct megafauna can be described either as keystone species or as ecosystem engineers, and their role in enabling and stabilizing particular ecosystem assemblies and landscapes is actually quite strongly supported by contemporary rewilding experiments and also by long-term field observations such as those conducted in the context of Yellowstone National Park. Although the effect of such large animal communities on climate regimes is generally not well understood, the reality of coupled ecoclimatic feedback systems, I think, makes it very, very probable that these animals also played a role, at least indirectly, in controlling, climates on various scales in these ecosystems. So the Northern Eurasian mammoth steppe, this is the extension of that mega superbiome here on the bottom, with its particular and quite distinct climate regimes, and which rapidly disappeared with the decline of its sort of inhabiting megafauna, may be a particularly good illustration of this interdependence between the activity of certain animals and the overall structure and nature of ecotones. So I refer to this basic condition, which animals were key Earth system agents, and in some sense as the antithesis to the Anthropocene as the ZOOCENE. In the ZOOCENE, I argue that large animal others rank as the prime Earth system agents and provide the majority of animal biomass, while hominins remain a largely marginal species. In contrast to much of the Holocene and especially the Anthropocene, the ZOOCENE is further characterized by a fundamentally patchy and discontinuous archaeological record, and that has something to do with the role and the effective size of animal populations in this particular setting. So life in the ZOOCENE, I would say, was accordingly stained in animal life, and animals were not only omnipresent in hominin landscapes, they were also dominant agents in shaping these landscapes, as I said. And elephants are particularly good examples of such prolific keystone species and environmental engineers. So the image here shows a proboscidean from the African Pleistocene Paleoloxodon recci, sorry. And I will not coincidentally start my exploration of animal significance in the ZOOCENE through the lens of material culture with a survey of particularly of human-elephant relationships. So elephant-related material culture first appeared sporadically in the archaeological record of Middle Pleistocene hominins in the form of bone tools, especially in late Acheulean and early post-Acheulean complexes. Notably, however, hominins did not treat elephant bones differentially from other raw materials, but mostly flaked them in very much the same way as they did with stone, as they did flake stone or flint. So the technologic and the operational sequence underlying stone and bone working are largely identical in these cases. Furthermore, hominins mostly imposed those forms and tool concepts into the elephant raw material. And these are the very same sort of forms and tool concepts that they already had adopted in their stone artifact technologies. And these forms actually typify hominin life in these contexts as well. And this is well sort of exemplified by the hand axe. So you see classic sort of flint hand axe here in the middle from the Israeli site of Mayan Baruch. And then you have copies of these hand axes made from elephant bone, for example, here from Italy, and here from the Israeli side of Revandim on the bottom. But you also have ordinary flakes, just like stone flakes made of elephant bone here from Revandim again here on the left side. So it's important also to note that many of these pieces are much less efficient in performing their functionality when compared to ordinary flint, basalt, or quartz hand axes or flakes. It is much more likely, therefore, and this has also been argued forcefully by Ranbakai and others, that these elephant-infused bone tools express the need to relate to proboscidean others and to insert elephant-ness back into the material fabric of human life more than anything else. Perhaps metaphorically, in the sense of giving back what has been taken. In the most general sense, I mean here, in the most general sense of anthropological gift exchange theory. So the broader context of these first glimpses of elephant materiality supports this interpretation. Elephant-boned hand axes are especially numerous in regions harboring rich proboscidean communities, such as the Eastern Mediterranean Levant and the Latium region, for instance, in central Italy. And this is well known from the paleontological evidence. And this whole sort of configuration most likely attests to a heightened level of interspecies intimacy already sort of in the lower Paleolithic. I think another observation that might be critical in this context as well is that the emergence of elephant-infused material culture broadly coincides with a period in human evolution when hominins started to become more mobile and dispersed across the continents. So this would have made the formative nature of elephant presence in particular landscapes much more obvious and salient to hominins. It might have also rendered elephants as rendered elephants potent spatial reference points and perhaps even landmarks, and elevating them in some instances at least even to a status of living monuments. More importantly, though, elephants move considerable distances themselves and in the process create characteristic elephant tracks. This is something you can see here on this image from Zimbabwe. And these tracks provide outstanding affordances for navigation and even dispersal. And it is known that other animals use these tracks as well. So hominins would not be the exception. Following elephant populations out of Africa might, for example, also have been a viable strategy in that context. And the frequent association of early hominin stone tools and elephant remains outside of Africa might, in fact, actually reflect this. So a consequential shift then in the architecture of human-elephant interfaces occurs only in the late Pleistocene, though, especially at the beginning of the European Upper Paleolithic. And this is one example that I show you here on this slide. The mammoth in these contexts is reassigned a role as cultural keystone species. And the technocultural system of early Upper Paleolithic communities is increasingly oriented towards the mammoth as a meaningful on-par co-inhabitant of the landscape, both in terms of raw materials, but also now as a central theme in visual culture. What you see here on the slide is a selection of figurative art, here on the left, from the Swabian Aurignacian, which is a regional expression of the early Upper Paleolithic in southwestern Germany. The Swabian Aurignacian's figurative art assemblage is by far dominated by two species, the cave lion and the mammoth. on the right. And these two species are also the dominant remaining megafauna in Aurignacian landscapes of the time. So on the right, you see now my synthetic attempt of reconstructing the whole sort of human-animal system of interaction in the Swabian Aurignacian, and to outline the key sort of human-animal relationships and their material expressions in this context, using what I call a triangle of interaction approach. So I obviously cannot go into much of the detail here, but the key point is that both mammoths and cave lions are not staple prey for Aurignacian people. We know this from the archaeology, but rather typify the extremes of human-animal co-dwelling and the very sort of ecological configuration of the landscapes in which this whole sort of phenomenon unfolds. What is more is that the mammoth is not just the most frequently depicted animal in the Swabian Aurignacian. Mammoth raw material actually serves as a principal component of Swabian Aurignacian life worlds in terms of its material fabric. Mammoth bones, and especially ribs, were collected and brought to human occupations in extraordinary numbers. And mammoth ivory was used to manufacture figurines, as we've seen, but also project points, all kinds of domestic tools, such as chisel and retouchers, and a large array of such perforated beads, and also pendants. At Vogelherd Cave in the Lone Valley, for instance, the original excavator Gustav Rieck also reported spatially separate caches and extra specially prepared depositions of complete mammoth tusks. This is a picture of that, and sometimes even heads, especially from juvenile elephants. Although this evidence is today difficult to corroborate, it would suggest and actually add to the picture that a large parade of cultural practices, some of which signal particular norms, values, and perhaps cosmological orientations, were actually centered on mammoth udders. So this slide is just sort of in support of what I already said. It shows the frequency of animal bone material here in this graph, measured in NISP, in two main Swabian Aurignacian deposits at Geisenklösterle and Vogelherd in southwestern Germany. The graph demonstrates that mammoth remains, although not the stable and most regularly hunted prey, is by far most abundant and massively outnumbers all other animal remains. So together with the evidence that many ivory beads, pendants, and figurines were sewed or otherwise attached to garments, this is a reconstruction of how this might have looked like. The material environment of the Swabian Aurignacian can thus be said to have constantly evoked the reference and perhaps even co-presence of mammoth udders. And this omnipresence of the animal in the material culture of the Swabian Aurignacian structurally mirrors, and this is quite interesting, I think, the salience and ecological importance of the mammoth in the surrounding landscape. So what I suggest is that the structural link between these two sort of saliences in the material culture and ecologically in terms of the animal actually expresses concerns for negotiating human worldly presence and identity in relation to mammoths, and performatively through actions and certain practices certify a certain relationship of sharing, mutuality, and complementarity that is sort of implicated in these relationships. It's worth noting here, I think, that the Aurignacian is a pioneer culture in the sense that it belongs to the first fully developed Upper Paleolithic complexes across Europe and is associated, as far as we know at least, exclusively with anatomically modern humans. And the importance of the mammoth in this context might signal animal-anchored landscape dynamics were sort of key in incipient processes of landscape learning. So how do I learn and make myself at home in a certain landscape? All right, so that was the first example. I will now move on to owl udders, so birds, because I think that these animals draw our attention to somewhat similar, but also in some way different facets of Pleistocene multi-species life. So owls have co-occupied many environments with hominins and share a long evolutionary history with the hominin lineage, but initially make their appearance merely as formative agents, formative taphonomic agents mainly, and appear as non-contiguous cave co-dwellers, which means that basically hominins and owls, even if they have occupied the same localities like karstic environments and such, have typically sort of alternated their habitations and did not necessarily sort of engage with one another physically. It is again in the European Upper Paleolithic, though, especially in its consolidated phase, the Middle and Late Upper Paleolithic, that they have left marked material imprints in the archaeological record. So what you see on this slide on the left is a remarkable assemblage of abstract owl-like ivory pendants and burnt clay figurines from the early Gravettian site complex in the Pavlovian Hill region in what is today the Czech Republic. And this assemblage of strigiform renderings, which is to my knowledge at least unparalleled in the Paleolithic, raises the question of why people have bothered to address and render owls in this context. So why did strigiforms become meaningful or worth materially engaging with? And we know that actually, yeah, as I said, in other contexts, they were apparently not. So the answer might perhaps again reside, I would argue, in the structure of ecological relationships, eco-cultural relationships that can be reconstructed for the respective setting. And this here is again given on the right. I mean, the whole thing at least. So again, the details do not matter. But what matters is that the prominence of owls in this context seems to be no coincidence. Paleoecological and environmental data from the region, for instance, indicates that the glacial landscapes of the Pavlovian Hill region were comparably tree-rich, what Jiří Svoboda, for instance, calls a wood steppe, which is quite unusual for Pleistocene conditions, and must accordingly have harbored a rich and really diverse owl community. And this is also supported by the archaeological fauna that is preserved and the paleontological data, that comes from neighboring sites of roughly the same time span. So most importantly, however, early Gravettian humans contributed, and this is what we can reconstruct from the archaeology, contributed themselves through their own behavior to a heightened exposition and expanded intersection with their own neighborhood. Human settlement activity was unusually intense, large-scale, and durable, possibly even semi-permanent in the Pavlovian Hill region at that time. Together with the stationarity and philopatry of many owls that co-inhabited the area, this must have created a strong sense of community and belonging, so that owl others could emerge, we could say, as a central pillar of human spatial identity, and helped in creating a special sense of place and belonging. So I don't want to sort of dwell on this, but and I also don't want to sort of invoke unjustified modern day analogies, but it is interesting at least to note that East Central Europe and in East Central Europe and Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans area, we know as sort of this area is known today for some unusually dense owl rosts forming every season, especially during the winter months. So for instance, in Belgrade, which is a major city in the region, people have observed all owl roosts of up to 200 birds who occupy trees in lightly wooded parkland areas close to Danube, for example. Another prime example, and I guess some people might know it already, is Kikinda, which is sometimes also called the owl capital of the world, which hosts up and sometimes more than 600 long-eared owls from mid-December until the end of February. So in total, and these are astonishing numbers, it has been calculated by local researchers that more than 30,000 birds were regularly wintering in the region since scholars actually began to count, and this is relatively recently. So the enrollment of owls in human deep history is indeed a story of special places and vibrant ecological settings where owl presence emerged as the cornerstone of the human experience, I would argue. Owls make their sporadic appearance in human visual culture with the developing European Upper Paleolithic, especially in the context of parietal art. And this is what you see on this slide. The earliest owl depiction actually comes from Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche region of southeastern France. this one. And it is also the only known Upper Paleolithic owl that I know that actually possesses some well-developed ears. To the left, you see the famous owl seen from the depth of Les Trois Frères, close to the Pyrenees foothills. Owl number 1 is from Marsoullas. Number 2 and 3, these are actually on mobile pieces, mobile supports, so these would be counted as mobile art. Come from Adrien Morin and La Manche, also from the two sort of respective sides of the Pyrenees, respectively. So notably, thus, almost all of these owl images, with the exception of the just mentioned Chauvet owl, derive from archaeological contexts close to the mountainous Pyrenees foothills, and especially snowy owls are known to have been abundant in the past there. So arguably, these are also liminal places for human activity, especially so when these images are placed deeply in cave interiors. The recently discovered rich middle to late Upper Paleolithic avifaunal parietal art assemblage from Grotte Margot, this is some examples shown here on the left, is actually the only post-early Upper Paleolithic example of owl imagery that is located, that is not located in close proximity to the Pyrenees. Grotte Margot, however, and this is sort of again a case in point, is situated in Midwestern France, firmly in what is today a modern biodiversity hotspot. And paleoecological and faunal data that goes back to the last glacial maximum indeed shows that this was also the case in the later part of the Upper Paleolithic, so exactly in the time frame when these images were most likely created. Thus, again, owls were rendered against the background of a vibrant ecotone in which strigiforms were probably a defining quality. So the interesting thing, I think, is, however, that this initial fairly sort of localized and patchy engagement with owls through individual images close to liminal spaces or at the sort of interstices of biodiversity hotspots, perhaps in the starting of the Middle Upper Paleolithic and certainly developed in the Middle Magdalenian, this is where most of these examples date to, were fundamentally changed in nature and spatial extent during the subsequent Upper Magdalenian, where owl images were basically replaced completely by a large-scale practice of highly complex and multi-stranded snowy owl carcass treatment, where feathers were removed, owl meat was probably eaten, and owl bones were marked and used for all sorts of material culture and artistic activities. And in this case, and this is what you see here on this map, so the crosses are the sort of evidence for this sort of complex carcass treatment of owls, whereas the other symbols, indicate what I've talked about just a few minutes ago. Sort of this expansion in space and the whole sort of the change of how owls were treated also indicates that the focus also shifted from these liminal places to a sort of landscape encompassing concern. So I would argue that this shift in attention actually signals that the status of the owls, especially of the snowy owls now, in this part of the Magdalenian world occurred. Owls did not only signify special situations or ecophysical conditions, as I said, and therefore demanding a somewhat distanced cultural processing, one could perhaps say, but were integrated to the heart of Magdalenian everyday life, and apparently began to denote country on a landscape scale. So their treatment suggests that they embodied references to all domains of material culture now and human behaviors such as subsistence, personal ornamentation, and art making. So overall, it is probably more than coincidence that especially the snowy owl, Bubo scandiacus, became a recurrent focus of human attention in the later part of the European Magdalenian. Snowy owls are more easily detectable in the landscape than most of their relatives and are known to regularly dwell, and that is therefore visible on exposed hills, stones, or tree trunks, for instance. And the recent study actually of the display behavior of these birds has also concluded that both their specific plumage coloring, perhaps a bit sort of counterintuitively, but also their habitual behavior, in fact, maximize the owl's visibility and perceptual prominence in the landscape. So these birds, I think, are the prime targets for conveying a sense of landscape. And this is, I would argue, exactly what we see in the developed sort of Upper Magdalenian. So another means through which animals can anchor human landscape experience and sense of environmentality, that is power relations and issues of what I call natural government, is active and consequential landscape modification and engineering. So what I've already sort of mentioned earlier. And here, again, I believe it's no coincidence that especially the beaver emerges as a centroid of material and artistic productions within the closed forested and hydrologically rich and highly textured environments which began to form in the early Holocene close to the former ice sheets of the last glacial, so especially in northern parts of Europe and Eurasia. These environments not only direct, I would say, perceptual and cultural attention to the dynamic aquatic realm, the beaver itself as a potent niche constructor is a central agent and architect in these environments, and thereby also creates unique foraging and especially fishing opportunities for its human co-inhabitants. And what this slide that you just see now shows is a range of beaver-oriented material culture that emerges at the end of the Pleistocene, especially in the Mesolithic, across southern Scandinavia, the Baltic regions, Western Russia, and the trans-Ural area. So these forest hunter-gatherers, as they're often called in the landscape, in literature, sorry, have developed tools like have used beaver mandibles, for instance, as tools, beaver jaws that are glued and probably used to some effect. But they've also carved various sort of beaver-esque figurines from bone, like these two, but also from amber, like this example here. And in some regions, especially in Latvia and Lithuania, these figurines actually seem to stay in the archaeological record, perhaps as long as into the Bronze Age, and therefore form what I call a time-transgressive tradition. And co-optation of, for instance, beaver mandible is actually known from the ethnohistoric record, right? And it is also known that people there try to adopt and assume certain beaver capacities by using these particular tools. So there's a certain sort of cosmological, but also epistemological dimension, typifying sort of this link between humans and beavers that is perhaps sort of graspable or becomes graspable through these material expressions. So even though the beaver became a potential cultural keystone species probably only after the rapid Holocene warming, it was certainly present also under glacial conditions. In Europe, at least. And we know that beavers gained some importance when the situational matrix of human-nature relations would allow it. But it is already notable also that in most cases, actually, beavers were apparently not considered central. So this is an example in which they actually were. So Anthony Brown and colleagues have, for instance, argued that the beaver helped to forge a productive and culturally meaningful ecological network between horses, eel, perhaps surprisingly, and beavers and humans in some parts of the Magdalenian world, in Western Europe specifically, especially in the context of large laterally extending braided river systems, where beavers would create ponds and larger wetland environments that would naturally trap these eels. They were already returning at that time after the last glacial maximum to Central Europe. And this is also well known from the archaeological record. So not only were these beaver-created biomes, as I said, attractive to both humans and horses, who were also drawn to these places, they would also create artificial eel traps. I've said that already. And Brown et al. Now propose that this niche construction behavior of the beaver created, in fact, a unique interactional matrix with specific eel-catching opportunities for Magdalenian humans. So they argue that the specific beaver-supported eel-catching strategy is depicted, in fact, directly in some pieces of Magdalenian portable art. So this is the piece in question here at the bottom right. This from La Madeleine. I mean, so on the one hand, you have isolated horse heads in some sites like Master Zil and again La Madeleine, and on the other hand, you have this. And this scene is interesting to round it out, because what it shows is actually exactly the configuration that they're interested in. So you have humans, you have horse heads, and you have snake-like figures, which they interpret as eels. And then you have some markings. I'm not sure whether whether this is even relevant, but they would even go as far as interpreting this as sort of water in the wider sense. So what they propose, actually, something that's also known from the ethnohistorical record, that that beavers created opportunities for humans not just to fish eel, but to use another species, namely horses, which were drawn to the same locations as traps for the eels. And that is known as using head horses, using the heads of horses as eel traps. And that's known from, as I said, from the ethno-historical evidence. And this is what they, and this is the way also they interpret these heads, not just as a stylistic quality or something like this, but it's an actual, so literal representation of humans using severed horse heads, placing them close to the ponds created by the rivers, and then catching the eels, sort of closing this ecological circle, if you like. So that animal landscape legacies can become important motivational devices for human agency and cultural practice is also evidenced by other lines of archaeological data. For instance, here by these sort of, I would call them paleo burrows that are widely documented in southern America, and that, as we know, date back to the Pleistocene and were most likely created by megafauna, by large giant sloths, or perhaps even giant armadillos. So these animal duct structures were later used as support, so as sort of artistic matrices by certain human groups. Geometric rock art of various ages occurs on them. I mean, some of it is shown here, but I mean, it doesn't really matter, but probably spanning from the early to the later Holocene. The main point is that humans were using the products of animal landscape agencies to motivate certain kinds of behaviors. Same is true. So we don't need to go to Southern America. We can also go back to Europe, to Upper Paleolithic cave traditions. We find similar examples as well here in the context of the cave bear and his sort of activities. So these two examples come from Western France again, Combel Gallery and Alden, and the red markings, I think, the gray markings, sorry, are natural sort of claw scratches by cave bears that were sort of left behind in the cave interior. And later humans came and used these very structures as sort of a motivation to expand them, to add to them and to imitate the very same patterns. And this here is also at a very sort of potent location within the cave, where there's a narrow passageway that connects some sort of major areas in that cave system. In the case of Alden, it's perhaps even more sort of striking. So the cave bears created this, at first sight, fuzzy pattern of scratching, and then the humans came in and sort of completed, in this case, a mammoth figure just by engraving a dorsal line that completes the image. So what we can say here is that that the cave bear, in some sense, to use Jane Bennett's words, for instance, was actively involved in the whole process of art making. at least in its proximal part of the chaîne à boitois, if you like. Yeah. So I will skip this, the example of incipient anthroecologies, because this is just sort of flipping things on its head. So we can not just look into human-animal relationships in terms of the opportunities that were created by animals that were then seized by humans, shaping various key practices in human everyday life, but also the other way around, that through certain activities and cultural practices that humans performed in the landscape, they changed the behavior of their animal co-inhabitants, and perhaps drawing them into particular sort of long-term evolutionary trajectories. So the emergence of commensalism among corvids, and this shown here is one example, but also sort of the impact of human settlement behavior on early adopter species like foxes, who regularly and frequently and quite easily actually try to take advantage of especially waste food that's accumulated close to and in human settlements, is something that has a much deeper time depth than is normally acknowledged. So what you see here is some isotopic evidence, again from the Swabian Upper Paleolithic sequence in southwestern Germany, where Baumann et al. Have investigated the dietary signals here in terms of the position of foxes in the isospace through time. And what they show is that from the Middle Paleolithic, which is shown here, to the early Upper Paleolithic and Middle Upper Paleolithic, not only does the sort of perhaps the dietary breadth of foxes perhaps expand, but what we also see is that some foxes, shown here in blue, develop a dietary profile that is entirely novel, that has nothing to do with what sort of foxes did before in the Middle Paleolithic. And further statistical analysis has even shown that what they have eaten most probably here is likely reindeer. And we know that in the Aurignacian and also in the Gravettian, reindeer is among the key staple species. So it is increasingly likely that these foxes are actually developing some sort of commensal profiles and taking advantage of some of the food leftovers that human settlements were producing at the time. Yeah, this is just a summary graph of the whole scenario that's pictured here. So we have, what we see at least is sort of a market diversification of perhaps even sort of group specific or even individual specific feeding strategies that more often than not actually take advantage in some way or another of human presence and behaviors. So as a last example, just to round things up, I wish to go back in time massively. This is also perhaps not common sense, but it has its purpose, I think, and to briefly touch upon Neanderthal animal relationships in the European Middle Paleolithic. And I will make this very, very brief because I know we are already sort of at the limits of time. And we can take up the issue if you want afterwards in the discussion. So I do this because I want to emphasize that these kinds of analysis and insights are not just limited to anatomically modern human, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, but I think there is in principle much to sort of disclose, even in sort of in much further removed temporal and even hominin contexts. So as proven hypercarnivores of their time, Neanderthals developed a large carcass fingerprint, one can say, and being close to them increased the chances of perhaps snatching some spoils of their hunting success as well from the perspective of animals. I think this has not really been taken into account enough. Neanderthal artifacts are regularly, we know this across sort of the whole of Europe, regularly associated with corvid and eagle remains and the removal of eagle talons. I mean, this is, for instance, here an example from Krapina in Croatia, has repeatedly been sort of invoked as evidence for the actually cultural modernity of these Neanderthal populations. And this is largely interpreted as a symbolic and even cosmological sort of expression of their very existence. Some have even proclaimed a cult of the sunbird. I do not necessarily sort of want to discredit these interpretations, but I think it's necessary, in the first instance at least, to look a bit more closely on the ecological relationships that actually underlie the production of the extraction and usage of these talons. And both corvids and eagles, which are, in terms of the bones, regularly associated with Neanderthals, as I've said, are actually in a close relationship with them when we think about the scavenging opportunities that arise when Neanderthals operate as hypercarnivores in the landscape. And I think that sort of this triangle that you see here is basically giving rise, as sort of an emergent product of that ecological triangle, specific sort of material expressions that we often too easily simply interpret as some sort of cultural behavior without context. All right. So to conclude, animals, I think, and I know I could have, I was only able to show you sort of some glimpses of that, but I think in the ZOOCENE, so in sort of from a deep historical perspective, we can say that animals are important Earth system agents, and they contribute critically to the maintenance and proliferation of planetary life. I think this is an important conclusion. Animals have also contributed in fundamental yet often overlooked ways to the evolution of our own species. So I've tried to show you some of these ways, although they're more subtle, but it has also something to do with my focus on wild animals, and that also has a purpose. I'll come back to that in a sec. It is not in opposition then, but in close connection with animal others that hominins have acquired the qualities we now consider quintessential or even exclusively human. Human-animal interstices are subject to transformative evolution themselves, and the deep time record of archaeology often elucidates specific trajectories of cohabitation and co-adaptation. One example was the owl case, but another might be the mammoth example, because at some point also the mammoth then goes extinct. So we can also have a look at that. So what's the role of animals in shaping long-term socio-material trajectories? And that's an important question that we can address. And to better understand how and under what conditions humans and animal behaviors meet and resonate on millennial scales, I think is key to really draw some lessons also for the Anthropocene, because we can see what the consequences of particular decisions are, even the non-intended consequences, because we have this sort of millennial scale window of observation, if you will. And lastly, and this is just to come back to what I said earlier, so that the purpose a little bit of my talk was also to show you that, that there is a deep history of animal significance to uncover that goes well beyond the beginnings of domestication. So there are important sort of dynamics to uncover that unfold between wild animals and early humans that have made a contribution, or at least left their mark in what we consider to be the human package, or the human condition. And I think much more research actually needs to go into that part, because it's often marginalized. So human evolution in the end is humanimal, to use Haraway's concept from the very beginning. So it is about the merging and constant fusion of constant engagement, constant tension, conflict, but also sympatry between humans and animals. So we as humans then, especially in the Anthropocene, I think can only understand ourselves if we consider us as a part of the deep history of life in general, and begin to disentangle the dynamics born out of the what I call the agential heterogeneity of nature. And that really requires to take seriously what animals are, what they do, what effects they have, But I think also, and this is often overlooked as well, that they have a history of their own in the sense that behaviors are not fixed in an essential way, even semi-eternally, but they themselves are subject to change depending on the context. And part of this context is human or hominin, dependent on where you are in space and time. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I think that was mostly what I wanted to communicate. Thank you very much.